Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Stu Bradin, President and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation, about the role of U.S. Special Forces in the 21st century and what the force needs to stay ahead of American adversaries. Then we break down the exit of White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, the U.S. Ukraine minerals deal, the latest on Iran nuclear talks, and why there's so much secrecy around the U.S. military campaign against the Houthis. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A packed show today. Later, you'll hear my conversation with Stu Bradin, president and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation. Global SOF organizes and hosts the SOF Week Special Forces Conference in Tampa, one of the largest gatherings of Special Forces personnel and the defense industry in the world. And the Washington Times is an official media partner for the event, and I'll be there on the ground all of next week, and we'll have some exclusive and I think pretty exciting podcast content for you all, which will roll out over the next few weeks from SOF Week. But before we get to Stu Bradin, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
SOF Week, Ben. That's going to be pretty interesting. I'm excited that you're going again this year. Right now, it's great to be here with you for another week on the podcast. As you know, I'm tracking several things. The first were some comments about President Trump's executive order calling for a futuristic Golden Dome missile defense shield, comments that U.S. Air Force General Gregory Guillot, who heads both Northern Command as well as NORAD, the U.S. Canadian North American Aerospace Defense Command. He told the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces on April 30 that, quote, immediate actions, end quote, are already being taken to implement Trump's executive order. Do you know that we're covering this Golden Dome discussion very closely in the threat status pages? We covered in our daily newsletter. We're tracking all of the companies involved and the extent to which this system will or will not become a reality. For our listeners, Ben, Threat Status is actually going to be hosting a major Golden Dome discussion event on May 13. I encourage people to go to the Threat Status pages and check out how to attend. We actually now have a special Golden Dome section at Threat Status. Next, Ben, I'm following the implications of the U.S. Ukraine critical minerals extraction deal that finally got signed at the White House in recent days. How will this deal impact the Trump administration's push for serious end-of-war negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? The deal, as it's written, and it still has to be ratified by Ukrainian parliament, but it essentially gives U.S. companies priority in accessing rare earth minerals in Ukraine and other valuable resources such as oil and natural gas. What's really interesting here, Ben, is that sources have told us that many of these critical minerals are under the ground in Ukraine's Donetsk region, which is currently occupied by Russian forces. These are things like precious metals that are critical to U.S. defense industries. We're talking about weapon making, things like that, and right down to precious metals used in iPhone production, things like that. So how this deal is going to actually get implemented is totally entangled with the push for end-of-war negotiations with Russia. And it really remains to be seen who gets leverage out of this deal. Does it somehow open the way for Trump to play a kind of three-dimensional chess in trying to convince the Russians to back off certain territorial claims on condition that Russian companies could be cut into the extraction process down the road? That's a pretty big unanswered question at this point. Finally, Ben, I'm continuing to track the Trump administration's pursuit of serious nuclear negotiations with Iran. The Iranians seem pretty serious about the diplomacy at this point. Iran's foreign minister is holding talks with European counterparts on May 2nd ahead of this weekend's fresh round of talks with U.S. officials. I think this is the third really serious round. There appears to be some real momentum here, but the reality is that nobody really thinks Iran is going to totally give up its uranium enrichment program. I know we talked about this on the podcast last week, but I thought it was interesting that former Biden administration National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made the comment in recent days that if Trump is going to get a deal with the Iranians, it's probably going to look an awful lot like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, deal that the Obama administration inked with Iran back in 2015 that Trump later pulled the U.S. out of in 2018. Now, obviously, China, Russia, and several European Union countries, Germany and others, were involved in that 2015 JCPOA. Thus far, Trump has pursued a unilateral direct deal between the U.S. and the Iranians. So I think it's interesting that the Iranians now appear to be trying to pull the Europeans into it, possibly to gain some kind of leverage. It will be interesting to see what comes out of this current round of talks, Ben.
Well, one of the subplots that I'm watching with this is how Israel responds. I mean, we remembered, a decade ago when the JCPOA 1.0 was signed, Benjamin Netanyahu with the poster board of the bomb at the UN and et cetera. So if we do get a JCPOA 2.0 or something similar that allows Iran's nuclear program to survive in some way, what's Israel's reaction to that? What does that do to the Netanyahu-Trump relationship? That's something to watch. Another thing to watch, Guy, major personnel shakeup heading in, to this new round of Iranian talks, the Russia-Ukraine talks, and that's National Security Advisor, White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, apparently fired by President Trump just a few minutes before we came on the air, or the news broke a few minutes before we came on the air, I should say. Waltz, as we've discussed on this show many times over the past month or two, was a central figure in the Signal group chat fiasco in which top officials discussed the U.S. military campaign against the Houthi rebels. A Signal chat with Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg, who was inadvertently added to it, apparently by Waltz. So we'll keep our eye on that for sure, and who takes his place inside the White House. But outside of just the Signal chat, Guy, Waltz has, of course, played a key role in the U.S. campaign against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. We talked a few weeks ago about his, sort of now infamous U.S. flag emoji description of the attacks in that Signal chat. But what's interesting to me here, Guy, among other things, is the contrast, or the disconnect, I guess you could say, between the fact that these Signal chats about the Houthi campaign are there in the press for anyone to read, versus the almost total lack of information coming from the Pentagon itself. And here's what I mean. Operation Rough Rider, which is the official name of the campaign against the Houthis, began with airstrikes on March 15th. Earlier this week, U.S. Central Command put out a fairly lengthy statement saying that since then, over a 6-week period, the U.S. has hit over 800 Houthi targets. But I went on the CENTCOM website just before we came on here, Guy, and that April 27th press release I just mentioned, that was the first official CENTCOM press release since March 14th, the day before Operation Rough Rider began. In other words, no official comments out of CENTCOM, at least on its website, about one of the most significant U.S. military engagements going on right now in the world. They have put out some more information on X and other social media.
Well, Ben, they did. There was a press release that came out acknowledging that a U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornet fighter jet actually was lost at sea in the Red Sea after it fell overboard from the USS Harry S. Truman on Monday, I believe. But even that statement did not have many details vis-a-vis the scope of the ongoing bombing campaign.
Correct. And it's just worth noting it came from the Navy and not from CENTCOM. But also, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's kind of a case in point here.
At least a $60 million
aircraft. Right. And it's also worth noting here, Guy, that, look, that first version of the statement did not mention exactly what happened. Now, later, U.S. officials confirmed on background, according to media reports, that the ship, the Harry S. Truman, was conducting a, quote, evasive maneuver, unquote. In other words, it was being shot at by the Houthis. That was not included in that initial information provided by the Navy.
I do want to say that there hasn't been any report of anyone being killed in this incident. There was a report of one U.S. sailor being injured, but we haven't gotten further details on that yet.
And we also haven't gotten further details on, or at least official confirmation of, 7 U.S. Predator drones shot down since March 15th, over just the past 6 weeks. That also, as you mentioned, I think last week, Guy, confirmed by U.S. officials and media reports on background. We talked at length in this show about the Houthi campaign, its goals, its price tags, whether it can be successful in what it's trying to do. But I do think it's time to kind of shine a light on the almost near total lack of information about these strikes and how that contrasts that you have these signal group chats with information that everybody denies is classified or sensitive, even though it pretty clearly is, versus no official comments coming out of U.S. Central Command almost entirely about the campaign. Speaking of transparency, Guy, one more thing I want to touch on briefly. Elon Musk reportedly stepping back from DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to concentrate more on his businesses, some of which, like Tesla, have fallen on some hard financial times to a degree over the past couple of months. But this is notable from a national security perspective for a couple of reasons. Number one, Musk is quietly stepping back without the public break from President Trump that I and a lot of people expected. That's interesting, and perhaps it's good because it saves us from a public spat between literally two of the most powerful people in the world. But perhaps more relevant to this show is the fact that the Musk-led DOGE push seems to have lost a lot of its steam before it really hit the Defense Department, the CIA, other corners of the national security and intelligence infrastructure in the U.S. That's not to say there aren't impacts. There's a major civilian workforce reduction across the entire government, including DOD. But there wasn't the mass purge of folks that we saw at the FDA or certain parts of the Interior Department, USAID, the Education Department, elsewhere across the federal government. Now, maybe you think that's good. Maybe you think it's bad if you were looking forward to Musk and his team getting their fingers deep into the operations of the Defense Department. But I can tell you, having just talked to a number of sources this week inside the Pentagon, they're quite happy about that they seem to have sort of weathered the worst, the initial wave at least, of DOGE and what it was trying to do with its effort to downsize, or as some would say, right-size the government. We'll see if this is the final chapter, sort of the end, or at least the slow decline of Musk's impact on Washington, D.C. and its national security community. And we are joined now by Stu Bradin. He's the president and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation. Stu retired as a U.S. Army Special Forces colonel in May 2014, over 3 decades of service. Stu, you've served all over the world, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, Afghanistan. And your organization, the Global SOF Foundation, is responsible for one of my personal favorite events of the year, SOF Week, coming up from May 5th through the 8th in Tampa. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Threat Status will be on the ground there. I'll have live podcast interviews from the convention floor, and we're an official media partner of the event as well. So, Stu, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate your time, Ben.
Of course. Stu, right off the top, for listeners who might not be familiar, can you briefly just walk us through 2 things? 1, what does the Global SOF Foundation do? And 2, what's sort of the mission statement, if you will, of the SOF Week convention this year?
Yeah, so the Global SOF Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit. We're 11 years old. And in 2020, we were designated by the United States Department of Defense as a national military association. So we're in that very small group like AUSA, the Navy League, the Air Force Marine Corps Association. The easiest way is to identify us as a professional association. What makes us different than everybody I just listed? We're joint, they're not, and we're international, and they're not. It's an organization that's focused on bringing the global special operations community together. They tend to be the first to deploy pre-crisis. And so we all have really good relationships. It's important relationships because often before political policy can often solidify, there's troops on the ground working together. And so by having what we call the good guy network, people that are familiar with each other and trust each other, that's the most important thing. We do that through convening the community. We do several events each year. We do one in Europe, one in the Indo-Pacific. We do one at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and one with the Air Force Special Operations Command. We also do a big one up on Capitol Hill. But of course, the mother of all events is SOF Week here at Tampa, Florida.
Stu, speaking of SOF Week, I've been going for years, all the way back when it was still SOFIC. I think it's been my fifth or sixth time there, and I feel like at each time I've been there, there's been a panel discussion or a keynote speech with some variation of what's the role of special forces in the era of great power competition that we're in now. Here, as we sit here almost halfway through 2025, do you feel like you've got an answer to that question at this point, or is that still kind of being hashed out?
I mean, well, the biggest challenge SOCOM faces right now is the value of soft, because everybody felt that the force, and I'm saying globally, was a CT force, and that is just crap. What happened at 9/11, I mean, prior to 9/11, we were one of the most deployed entities in out of any function of any military anywhere in the world. It was civil affairs, special ops, and actually Patriot batteries were scattered as far as the eye could see, and they're, over 300 days a year of deployment per person. So we were at war prior to 9/11. We just was happy to see the conventional force show up finally and participate. But we were in, small little skirmishes, friction points all over the world. After 9/11, they asked special operations to basically transform itself and be more direct action focused versus building partner capacity, which is absolutely in the DNA of special operations. It's not a stretch. It's, the difference is, hey, this is a different mission than strategic reconnaissance or building partner capacity, but it is absolutely one of the soft mission sets. And we fell in on direct action for a decade and a half, almost 2 decades doing that. And so when we came out of Iraq and we came out of Afghanistan, one, terrorism didn't give up on us. We gave up on it. But if you read any intelligence estimate anywhere in the world, all the adversaries out there are significantly larger than they were pre 9/11. But we just pretend they don't exist because Lord knows we don't want to relive that again.
Yeah, we've had numerous guests on this show, Stu, say that they counterterrorism analysts, people who served, saying they think this is the most dangerous moment since the pre 9/11 era in terms of terrorism.
We refuse to acknowledge it. Yeah, there's nothing worse than knowing there's a problem and refusing to acknowledge it. And you know what'll happen? We'll get hit like we always do. There'll be hearings, there'll be investigations. All the information will have been right there in front of everybody. The reality is nobody wanted to do anything about it because, they say, oh, here we go again with another Afghanistan or Iraq and stuff. And so that's still happening. And as far as great power competition, I mean, we were all over the world confronting the Chinese, the Russians, through their surrogates, which is what they mainly use. So this is what special operations was actually built to do. When JFK, he created special forces and the Peace Corps all simultaneously for a purpose. And it was to counter the communist influence all over the world. Well, that was Russia and China. Well, guess what? It's the same damn actors. I mean, you can add in Iran and North Korea now, and those are the big four that are out there trying to stir stuff up. And a lot of times they're just being disruptive to interfere with our economic gains. They're trying to slow us down economically because they acknowledge that as our preeminent power.
Right. Stu, I want to come back to the counterterrorism in just a moment, but one more on great power competition. You mentioned, SOF being worldwide. So I feel like you're in a good position to maybe answer this question. Where do you see our adversaries in terms of their special forces capability? I mean, certainly there's no doubt the U.S. Special Forces remain the very best in the world, but, as part of China's effort to supplant us in the global order and potentially prepare for a military clash amid that broader military buildup, do you see them trying to build out some sort of special forces sector that could potentially rival ours in some way?
It's interesting. No, the answer is no. Russia did build a joint special operations headquarters with a 3-star or 4-star. But I mean, they rely on conscripts. And if you're doing conscription, there's nothing special about a conscript. It takes a long time to build a special operations operator. This is why when you hear people talk about retention and readiness and all that stuff, it matters a lot because it's a huge investment. It's a long-term investment. And so the Russians don't have that. The Chinese have about 8 different special operations entities slung throughout their national security apparatus. They're all stovepiped, most of them, the guys are jumping through rings of fire and throwing ninja stars and stuff, like the 80s. It's pretty sad. I'm sure they have some good capability and stuff, but again, they too they're transitioning away from the conscript stuff. But right now, they're not there yet.
You mentioned, investments and long-term investments. So I want to ask you about money and budgets because, as you well know, there's a climate in DC right now of cost cutting, efficiency, save money. Where can we get rid of fat? Are you worried about that? You think it's possible DoD may be less willing to sort of take, make the kind of financial investments that we need to make to keep SOF at the cutting edge here? Are you afraid? Is SOF going to get touched by some of that we're seeing right now, you think?
So when you talk to me, my lens that I look through is one from the Ukraine and Gaza, and I look at it irregular warfare and modern warfare. Most of the legacy items that we have are burning in wheat fields in the Ukraine. We keep wanting to make the M1 tank heavier, and it burns whether it's 50 tons or 75 tons. It doesn't matter. The modern battlefield is designed with so much precision that if you're wrapped in metal, you have a low probability of survival. Very low. I mean, electronic warfare, EW, has got to be one of the scariest things I've seen lately. It used to be just where they would jam entire bands, and now they can be extremely specific down to a toaster or seriously, almost like they were going after an IP address. They're very, very sophisticated. And when I say they, it's everybody because this technology is proliferated throughout every country in the world. It's not a secret. We are a SATCOM addicted organization. We can't go anywhere or do anything without SATCOM or the internet. And it is very, very simple for adversaries, not just China or Russia, but to disrupt our networks and bring us to our knees. And so I mentioned this because when I look at, Admiral Olson used to always say, you are what you buy. And I just saw the $150 billion reconciliation bill. We're just buying more of the same old legacy stuff. Now, SOF is getting, I want to say it's about 1.4 billion in that, $150 billion plus up. And that's great. They need it. The problem is with the reconciliation bill, there's no O&M money behind it. So anything purchased there's no funding behind it to sustain those things. It's a great step in the right direction. If you look at SOCOM's budget, it's been frozen since 2019. That's about a 14% loss in purchasing power since 2019. And everybody goes, well, it's O&M money. You can move it all around. Well, the cost of sending someone to Iraq's about $3.50 a day. The cost of sending someone to Singapore is about $500 a day. Okay. So it's not a just shift your stuff and, absorb the pain thing. It's what do you want people to do? Also, when you look at contingency operations, during 9/11, we all had, we had OCO money, and it was basically debt, and then DOD wore that out to the tune of about $80 billion a year. And then, of course, Congress weaned the department off of that, But at the end of the day, when you have a contingency operation and you deploy forces all around the world because the president says deploy, there's no funding to cover any of that. And so at the bottom of each order, it says capture all costs for possible reimbursement. And often they do get reimbursed. It's often at the end of the year. It's often when you can't spend the money, you don't have enough time to burn the money, you can't buy the things you need. Their philosophy is, hey, we did it. We gave you back your money. Thank you. We had 60 days to execute the money and could only do about 40% of the execution on that funding. So I don't know who, don't pat yourself on the back too hard is what I would tell people. Look, I believe that we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on legacy items that will not survive modern warfare. We have a force that cannot deploy. And once it's deployed, it cannot be employed. It can be detected. If you mass a force anywhere in this world, you will get annihilated. You will absolutely be annihilated. And nowadays, with long-range fires, the distances that they can impact you are thousands of miles, not kilometers. All of this has changed and stuff. And so I believe that you're in a stage of irregular warfare where soft, cyber, intel, information, and commerce, economics are the five big things that will stop a major theater operation. And so I think SOF is and those other elements I just described are in a position to prevent a major theater war versus allowing it. If you stop someone from massing, the probability of there being a major war is very low. And so the soft budget, in my opinion, is not anywhere near where it needs to be. I mean, I look at the department and they write about irregular warfare. That's, you can say unconventional, asymmetric, low intensity, put whatever label you want on it, but it's everything that's not conventional in nature. Right now, the term is irregular warfare, but who's the proponency inside of the Department of Defense? There is nobody, kind of just freewheeling out there. I'm a believer that U.S. SOCOM, and so that's their job. No one knows what low intensity conflict is. That's a 1980s term. No one even knows what that is, but we have ASD Solic, and people go, "What is thick?" What is? I mean, you ask young people, they have no clue. It's not in doctrine anywhere. But I think right now competition consists significantly of irregular warfare things, everything left of a major theater operation, and we have no proponency. We assume that each geographic combatant command will fight it on its own, and they need a lot of support to take on those things, and they need a lot of support to do that the right way. Admiral Paparo has been very explicit. I mean, he loves special operations. You probably could never give him enough. I would say the same goes with Southcom. What the Chinese and the Russians do is they basically have surrogates all over the world. The same way, they had Contras, they were doing it in Africa. I mean, this is not new. This is why I don't know. Everybody acts like great power competition is new. I was like, y'all missed the 70s and 80s. I mean, I don't know how far back their history goes, but that's all it was. I mean, that's all it was. We're back to doing the same thing. They don't call themselves the Soviet Union, but it is still, the People's Republic of China. It's the Russian Federation, for lack of, is the new Soviet Union. And then you have North Korea and Iran in there. Since 79, Iran's been a bad actor. And none of this has changed. They have all formed military alliances, and they don't, they're not going to take us head on. That's not their doctrine is not to do that. And we keep trying to modify conventional forces to engage in competition. If you have a 1st Armored Division and you're sitting at Fort Bliss, Texas, and I was an Armored Cav officer when I started out on the East-West German border in the 80s. But if you have them, they're sitting there. If you're going to deploy them, pick a spot in the world, they've got to get on railheads. First, they've got to muster everybody. Then they've got to put everything on trains. They've got to ship it down to Beaumont, Texas, and put them on ro-ro ships. Then they got to sail them through the Panama Canal or across the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. They've got to disembark all these things. I think your probability of making that happen is so low. And I don't think, political leaders see that as a viable option to prevent something, only escalate something, And that's all dependent on being in a permissive environment. What happens if it's not permissive and you can't do all these things? This is, I just think we are living in a fantasy land, and we haven't configured ourselves for irregular warfare, modern warfare.
That's fantastic. We covered a lot of ground there. So thank you. Thank you so much, Stu Bradin. Pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that the U.S. military is losing its competitive edge when it comes to partnering with other nations and being really the first chosen security ally of countries around the world. I'm not saying across the board, because there are examples of growing partnerships. But in some parts of the world, there are nations who are increasingly willing to partner alternatively with China, which is scrambling to build up its joint exercises and security alliances, not only with Russia, Iran, and North Korea, but also with countries like Egypt in the Middle East. It's notable, Ben, that the China-Egypt Eagles of Civilization 2025 Joint Air Force exercises began on April 19 and will end in early May. These drills are expected to strengthen links between Egypt, which boasts Africa's strongest military and is actually a strategic U.S. ally, and China, which is expanding militarily and has an East African naval base in Djibouti on the Red Sea. There are definitely questions about how these joint exercises involving China can play out in the future. Does the U.S. ever get tangentially involved? Could it actually lead to more military to military talks between the U.S. and China, depending on how global geopolitics unfold? But it's my threat of the week that the U.S. is definitely being challenged on that front.
My threat of the week, Guy, is a lack of Defense Department civilian firefighters, which is something that I think a lot of people might not ever think about, and something that, frankly, isn't even really on my radar very often, and I do this for a living. A new GAO report, Government Accountability Office report, this week dives into the issues with some pretty startling facts about DoD civilian firefighters who are federal employees, but civilian DoD personnel, not actual military personnel. If you've been to military bases, Guy, and I have oftentimes, you know there's sometimes the size of small cities. I was at Fort Bragg in North Carolina recently, and that military base is quite a bit bigger than the town I grew up in, for example. But the GAO report says that the DoD has experienced longstanding staffing issues within civilian firefighters. From 2019 to 2023, DoD employed fewer civilian firefighters than actually authorized in the federal budget, below the minimum staffing level required for safe operations. Now, DoD is about 93% of its minimum staffing levels for civilian firefighters, which sounds pretty good, but remember, that's just the bare minimum to ensure that military bases can be protected from major damage, structural or environmental problems if there's a fire at a base. Now, here's one reason for the issue. DoD identified causes of its staffing gaps, such as competition from local fire departments that offer better pay and work schedules. And the GAO said that DoD civilian firefighters at 5 selected locations worked more hours than local firefighters and made less per hour in base compensation. So we don't have time to go through any more of the figures in detail. But look, it's an issue that's really under the radar. And I think that's why it's worthy of being highlighted as a threat of the week. And with that, thanks as always, Guy. Thanks for another week here on the podcast. A huge thanks to Stu Bradin from the Global SOF Foundation for a really in-depth deep dive into special forces in the 21st century. And a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.